Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. With us is an old friend, a seasoned diplomat, and former State Department official, Frank Wisner. As we sit here, we are met with some real challenges in our foreign relations. A decision on whether to tear up the Iran nuclear treaty, which must be made in May, upcoming talks at the summit with North Korea, and a possible trade war over tariffs with a number of countries, including possibly China. Some say these challenges are to some extent of our own making and amount to an acute foreign policy crisis. The situation emerges as all the more acute against the backdrop of recent personnel changes in the White House, the State Department, and the CIA. Frank, we're pleased to welcome you back to the program to shed some light on the problems.
Thank you, Jim.
Now, let's start with the reshuffling we've witnessed, and we might start with your former employer, the Department of State. The Secretary of State is dismissed with a tweet. I don't remember in my lifetime a cabinet member being dismissed with a tweet. Usually there's a meeting or a phone call or a letter. What do you make of all this?
Well, happily, it's the first time I remember, but then tweets are not that ancient a practice. Other secretaries of state have been forced out of office. Some have resigned, but this is most unusual. This will amount to Rex Tillerson having served, I think, is the second shortest tenure of any secretary in the history of this country. The way it's done sends a destabilizing signal around the world, which is looking for predictability and steadiness in American policy and is faced instead with surprise events. This is just one.
Why was Tillerson fired, and fired so summarily, in your judgment?
Well, you know, I obviously don't know the president's inner thinking and wouldn't pretend to. The common reasons attributed to the firing basically are around disagreements he had, disagreements over how to manage the North Korea account, disagreements over Iran and the nuclear deal, the JCPOA. That appears to be one set. Apparently as well, the style of the two men were somewhat different. The president wasn't comfortable with the style of Tillerson as he saw it. But beyond that, I'm sorry, I just don't have any insight into the president's thinking.
Should a president have as Secretary of State somebody he likes and is comfortable with, or somebody whom he needs to speak truth to power?
Well, he needs to have a Secretary of State in whom he has confidence, will reflect his point of view and his administration's policies, to be able to carry his word with authority to foreign governments. That's the first attribute. So they have to be on the same wavelength. And if they're not, then there is a serious problem that has to be corrected with either a change of policy or the change of personnel. Do they have to be intimate friends? No, that's clearly not a high priority. They have to get along with each other, be able to speak candidly to one another. That's also highly important. But again, I think the most important point is there has to be an image and a fact of confidence and steadiness in the relationship so that the world at large and the American public know when the Secretary of State speaks, he reflects the will and desires of the president.
Now, Tillerson presided over what many see as a deconstruction of the State Department, a depopulation. 6 of the top 9 positions remain unfilled. 60% of the diplomatic ambassadors have been, posts have been left vacant. I think 40% of the diplomatic ministers are next tier. It has been said that this has hurt the morale of the State Department and has really crippled our foreign policy effort. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, and you left out one other fact, which is material, and that is a major reduction in the State Department's budget at a time when our international obligations are running at a very, very high level.
30% reduction, and I left out another thing which is material, and that is the tremendous reduction in applicants to take the Foreign Service exam. So we're not going to have a pipeline of new people coming on stream.
Well, if you take all of them together, of course, it's hugely upsetting to all of us who have counted on a steady, professional diplomatic service to support the Secretary and the President and the administration with quality advice, an ability to represent American views in foreign countries, an ability to call things as they need to be called. The removal of middle tier and upper tier officers and the reduction in the intake at the bottom really threatens the functioning of our diplomatic service. And without it, we are much weaker as a nation. As I would say is true of other professional services in our federal structure who need to be nurtured and preserved. They work for the president, the administration. They're not freestanding bodies. This talk about deep state is just nonsense.
And so you would say the attacks on deep state, on our intelligence community, on the FBI, sort of have a carryover reverberation to the agencies like the State Department?
No question. And it carries over, even more importantly, to our image around the world, which is weakened when foreign nations see the diplomats who are representing, speaking for the United States, undermanned, reduced in importance, sidelined. So with whom do foreign governments communicate their opinions so they get to Washington and are interpreted and put in an orderly manner so the president can make decisions?
Sounds pretty chaotic. Now we have, as Tillerson's successor, Mike Pompeo, graduate of West Point. I think he was first in his class, a lawyer, went to Harvard Law School, but certainly with a very hardline right-wing political record. Do you think his appointment will make for any change in policy?
Obviously, it's much too early to say exactly what Mike Pompeo's nomination will mean. He's got to go through confirmation hearings. He'll be questioned closely as he goes before the Senate. You will hear his views on policies, what he and the president have worked out, and we'll get to know that pretty quickly. My own thoughts are that the key is to have a functioning relationship between the president and the Secretary of State. Without that, our diplomacy is walking on one leg. It's just not functional.
So this is an improvement.
This will be an improvement. Second, Mike Pompeo has a reputation of having run the CIA with considerable respect for its professional services and bringing those along and nurturing them. If he brings those skills, if they are as accurately described as I just stated them, and he brings those skills to the State Department, it'll be a net plus for the State Department.
But of course, he said in the past that we should tear up the Iran nuclear agreement, and he certainly has taken a hardline pro-Israeli, anti-Palestinian position in the past. Do you think he'll continue with policies like that?
Well, I have no reason to think he won't. He has been very clear, just as you've said. I, of course, believe that taking a position on Iran that opposes our capacity to deal with that country, which is a key actor in the Middle East, and alienate our ability to conduct diplomacy, help reduce tensions, find common ground, is not in the national interest. If the steps are taken that the president has talked about of disassociating the United States from the Iran nuclear deal and reintroducing sanctions in May, again, I think this will be very harmful to the national interest. We'll separate ourselves from our allies. We'll create a new bout of tension. We'll put ourselves back on a track for war, and we'll devalue our word as a party to international agreements that respects our undertakings.
Well, this agreement took 20 months to negotiate. You were actually one of the tier 2, perhaps tier 1 negotiators. The agreement had the effect of removing sanctions from Iran and possibly leading to a normalization of relationships, and also of delaying their nuclear program, such as it was, for at least a decade. So what would be the downside of continuing with this agreement? The President of the United States says it was flawed, but he doesn't say how it was flawed, and he says he's open to continuing with it if we remove the flaws.
Well, I share your views about the value of the agreement. Won't quarrel with a single one of them. I also am not entirely sure what the flaws are the President's talking about. He's mentioned things like the duration of one element of the agreement, a duration that I believe is not correctly demonstrated. The agreement, even at the end of its 10-year, a portion of its at the end of 10 years, after that period, Iran remains under IAEA inspection and part of the NPT and bound by its obligations under the additional protocol. These all sound like technical matters, but they constrain massively Iran's ability to break out and create a nuclear weapon. So charges that at the end of a finite period, Iran will stumble into a nuclear weapon are simply untrue.
Okay, so our audience will know the IAEA is the UN agency which has an inspection regime, and the NPT is the Non-Proliferation Treaty to which Iran is a party. Now, if we tear up the agreement, is that going to spur the Saudis, for example, to inaugurate a nuclear program, and will it spur the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East?
Well, the Saudis have announced that they want nuclear power, and there are plenty of good reasons to reduce dependence on petroleum, hydrocarbon-based power generation and move to nuclear power for a portion of their power supply. But they've also said that if Iran goes for a nuclear weapon, then Saudi Arabia will match that. This presents the administration with a complex choice in approving the licensing of a nuclear capability and exports thereunder to Saudi Arabia. We are not in the business of enhancing proliferation around the world, not under this administration or any other. But I don't think that's the main problem. I think the problem is the removal of the United States from the nuclear agreement with Iran will render that agreement empty and will release Iran from the constraints that Iran's been under, will frustrate our allies, will give license to the Chinese and the Russians, and will measurably increase dangers in the Middle East and undercut our reputation as a responsible party in the global non-proliferation regime. I see no advantage in it. In fact, one could have hoped for the opposite, and that is, with a nuclear agreement as the base point, then to begin to look ahead at dealing with some of the crushing problems of the Middle East in a diplomatic manner, negotiating balances between Sunni, Shia, Gulf states, Iran, negotiating outcomes in Syria and Iraq, which are fraught with violence and destruction. All of this begins to take shape. Iran is a consequential Middle Eastern power, cannot just be dispensed with.
Even as we speak, the President of the United States is meeting in Washington with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. What do you think they're saying to each other about Iran?
Well, I'm certain, given the track record, that Mohammed bin Salman is arguing that the United States has to maintain a very tough posture towards Iran. And I have no problem with a tough posture towards Iran. There are plenty of problems posed by the growth of Iranian power and its extension in the region. But the question is, where does the United States want to be? Does it want to be on one side or the other? Or does it want to be the party that builds bridges between contending forces, reduces global tensions, and opens the way for negotiated outcomes to the region's problems? I argue it's clearly the latter.
So if there is a crisis brewing in the Middle East because we tear up the Iran nuclear agreement, and you referred to that. Would this be a crisis of our own making, with the possibility of a war between Saudi Arabia and its allies, the Emirates and other Sunni nations, and Iran?
Well, I'm not. The Middle East is fraught with crises. Anything that accentuates the crisis-ridden atmosphere is clearly a negative. In fact, I would argue, had we not had constraints on the Iranian nuclear program, then every other problem in the Middle East would have been measurably worse, more dangerous, more threatening to ourselves and friends like Israel and Sunni friends in the Gulf and elsewhere in the Arab world. So the Iranian nuclear deal removed one level of risk from the equation. To reintroduce it is to make the whole equation a great deal more unstable and dangerous.
Now, in May, at just about the same time that we have to make a decision on the Iran nuclear deal, to certify or decertify, in or out, the president has said he wants to have direct talks with the leader of North Korea. Do you think there's been adequate preparation for these talks?
First of all, I think the important thing to keep an eye on is that the invitation to the president to visit North Korea came indirectly through the South Koreans. And as of today, to the best of my knowledge, it has not been followed up with a formal North Korean invitation or any of the conditions that might surround that invitation. So we must watch carefully and see exactly how the invitation comes and what it says. And then there's some very tough questions. Where will the talks take place? How do you then organize the talks? Over the years, the United States has prepared itself amply for the potential of talks with North Korea. The file drawers in Washington are filled with contingency plans. What's missing is a clear line of authority with a Secretary of State who's just left, a State Department that is not fully manned, an NSC that is relatively new to the task, who's going to organize the dossier.
It talks that McMaster, the National Security Advisor, may also be on the chopping block. So.
I don't read the president's mind, but those talks, or that sort of chatter has been quite evident. But getting a stable team of advisors with skills who know how to access the past research is really important. And we haven't done that yet to the best. I can't see how we could have done it absent responsible people, well-briefed people in senior positions. But that can be overcome. It's not my greatest worry. My greatest worry is what strategy we will pursue. What will the president decide he wants to pursue, and what will the North Koreans decide they want to do? While we look at the North Koreans as having done something quite remarkable, inviting the president, the North Koreans for years have made it clear they want the respect of a meeting at the top and between the United States and North Korea. In a sense, they've achieved that objective already with the way we've responded. Now, I'm in favor of a meeting at the top, but I hope the meeting at the top will set an agenda, not try to negotiate an outcome which would be much too complex to be reached simply by a meeting between the two top figures.
But wouldn't it be more intelligent to have a meeting at the foreign minister level first, in which the agenda is set, and then have a meeting at the top?
Yes.
Or should I say more orderly?
More orderly, yes, I think you're right. That's the way business is normally done. But I'm not prepared to give up all hope. If the president and the leader of North Korea meet and create an atmosphere and a broad agenda that can then be filled in by foreign ministers and subordinates, well, we'd be off to a better start than we are right now. Almost anything is better than threats of bloody nose or all-out war and
fire and
annihilation
fury.
And large buttons that can be pressed on people's desks and fire and fury. It's not, that's not exactly where we all want to be.
Okay, let's revert from fire and fury and back to personnel. We haven't mentioned Mike Pompeo's possible replacement as director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Gina Haspel. What do we know about her?
Well, we know that Gina Haspel is an accomplished professional, one of the most respected people in our intelligence service. And she merits that distinction, given her record throughout her career. We also know that the agency is uncommonly well run when it's run by a professional. My mind goes back to Richard Helms, who was a terrific director of Central Intelligence. And
the man who kept the secrets.
I can see in Mrs. Haspel a person of really tremendous capability. The problem is she will be heavily attacked for her role in what has been charged, the management of secret sites and the use of torture. I believe that she has a unique opportunity when she testifies before our Senate in her confirmation hearing. If she can use that occasion to step forward and say, it is not the policy of the United States nor of her agency to engage in the use of torture, she'll do the nation a great deal of good. And she's got a role model. Secretary Mattis has said himself as regards to the Pentagon, that's his view. But to have our top future intelligence officers say the same thing would matter a great deal, would send a very powerful signal.
So will she have to say she regrets her role in the waterboarding program in 2002, where she went to Thailand at one of the sites and actually supervised the exercise?
Well, I'm not going to try to put words in Mrs. Haspel's mouth. She's extremely intelligent. She'll know how to phrase her answers. The point I'm trying to make is slightly different. What we ought to be looking for is not a rearview mirror on what happened in the past, as much as we want a statement of firm policy of where this nation stands, both on principle and on the practicality of the use of enhanced interrogations. And if she can come out and say that on behalf of her agency, she'll have made a huge contribution to the way the agency looks at itself, the way we all look at it, and the way this reprehensible practice needs to be put into our past and behind us.
Okay, so let's go from torture to China, because we find with the president saying that he's going to sanction China with $50 billion in either tariffs or other sanctions because they have misappropriated our intellectual property or retrofitted it or whatever they've done. Is that going to invite a trade war to China, and what do you see as the consequence?
Well, we are headed into a period of great uncertainty and high degree of tension, and it comes in several forms. First of all, the steel tariffs, which will come about this week, and while China's not a major steel exporter to the United States, it'll be affected, and it will consider its options then. But if we then go on to the 301 findings, or 301 plus findings, and we place restrictions on Chinese visas, we place restrictions on Chinese investment, then China is going to face some serious issues. Does China want to retaliate step by step for every step we've taken? Or does China want to try to find some ways to accommodate us? I don't think I know the answer to that fully. It'll probably be a bit of both. I think we as Americans owe the president a debt of support for at least one aspect. There isn't any doubt that China has had huge advantages in our trading and investment relationship. Our companies invest in China under conditions substantially less favorable than Chinese companies are here. China does engage in the theft of intellectual property rights, and the WTO cannot protect us.
World Trade Organization.
So the World Trade Organization. So there are real issues, and you can't just keep kicking them down, kicking the can down the field. It doesn't work. So I'm pleased that we're being firm, but firmness must come with flexibility. Otherwise, if we enter into a tit-for-tat trade war, I worry deeply about major export sectors of the United States, as well as the destabilization of the international trading system, which
particularly
is really
from the agricultural areas, pork and soybeans and other things that we sell to China. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I have a question for you, Frank Wisner. And the question is, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of American foreign relations?
Jim, I've served my country for many years. I'm always an optimist about the United States, but I recognize we're going through a very tough, very dangerous period, profoundly different than any period since the end of World War II, and we need to adjust to it, but adjust sensibly.
Frank Wisner, thank you so much for coming by, and thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.